AfriForum and Great Brook River Business Forum will challenge the decision by government to close certain beaches over the festive holidays. They will argue that the decision to close beaches in the Eastern Cape and Garden Route from December 16 to January 3rd is unconstitutional. Joining us for a legal sense of these developments is Associate Professor Cathleen Powell, Associate Professor in Public Law at the University of Cape Town. Prof, thank you so much for joining us and for your time this afternoon. Now, AfriForum says that the limiting of access to beaches amounted to the restriction of a basic human right. The lobby group has said this. Now, do they have a case here? What do you make of this?
Well, Section 21 of the Constitution does protect freedom of movement. So, yes, there is a right which these regulations are interfering with. They're limiting those rights. Whether that's unconstitutional will depend on whether the limitation is unjustifiable. And that's a balancing act that one hopes government does before it even makes the regulations, but which, if the regulations are challenged, then go to court for that balancing act. We're given a series of factors that the court must consider when it considers whether the limitation on the right is justifiable.
All right. So, I mean, this is not the first time that government has been taken to court. We've seen this happen several times, during the course of this pandemic. Now, has the government followed the law in its conception and enforcement of lockdown regulations?
No, and I think that's part of the problem. It was interesting to see Minister Cele being praised by somebody at, I think, Sea Point Beach in the little clip that you showed, because although a lot of people accept that restrictions are necessary to fight COVID, the government has tended to do so in a fairly incoherent way. It has done so without explaining itself to the people of South Africa. So what it has done is kind of take a krachtdadigheid sort of position where it says, right, I'm the boss, now you listen to me. In fact, in the clip, Cele was also heard to say that, something along those lines, when he was challenged for stopping that advertising, the commercial on the beach. He said, well, this overrides all the provincial and all the other measures. He's wrong there. He's wrong in law. So part of the problem is that the government has stepped in, thinking it can say everything it wants and do, make all the rules, and not itself checking whether it's abiding by law at each stage. When challenged, it also hasn't produced a careful justification of what it's doing. It has simply said, oh, well, we need to do this to protect the country from coronavirus, but it doesn't explain why or how that's meant to work.
Now, before we explore the legal side of things even further, where does the morality and the ethics sit in all of this? I mean, as I'm speaking to you today, we saw in the past 24 hours alone, 10,000 new infections reported in South Africa. Now, one would want to be in the case with government, given, the dire circumstances that we're finding ourselves in. But what does government have to do in order to make or break this case, as it were, on the morality and the ethical side of it in the courts?
That is a very good question. And I think government does have a much better chance of doing that sort of campaign here than it would, say, in the USA, where there's such an allergic response to restrictions on freedom, as though that is the primary issue and not responsibility towards our fellow citizens. I think South Africans and the whole concept of Ubuntu, we understand the idea that we have a responsibility towards the people around us. And if the government is prepared, while being firm, on the other hand, also being very clear about why these measures are necessary and how they work, so having a lot of education, and then thirdly, making sure that its own forces, so the police and those days when we had the army involved, that they stay strictly within the limits of the law and they do only what is actually required by the regulations. Then I think they can persuade people, firstly, to believe that, look, this is going to make a difference. What I do, whether I wear a mask or not, is going to make a difference to other people. And secondly, that there's a point to it, I'm going to be protected. And if I don't do it, I might be caught out. but the main reason I'm going to do this is because it's the right thing to do. I think the government can spearhead that. We as citizens need to also come to the party and show that we accept the underlying principle. The problem becomes when we resist the government because it acts outside of the law, and then it loses the trust that is necessary for the whole COVID-19 pandemic to be actively and effectively combated.
Prof. Powell, if we have to look at previous cases, for instance, the tobacco industry case, I mean, they were fighting around the implementation of the Disaster Management Act in itself. What are some of the key learnings that we can learn from that court case and that matter in particular that will probably be displaying itself out now in these recent court cases that will probably play out in the next couple of weeks?
I imagine that the tobacco case was one of the most significant ones, in that it upheld the act while disapproving or dismissing the regulations. I think what we learn from this is more or less that the Constitution and the legislation do allow for the limitation of rights if it is needed for a very strict category of purposes, for legitimate government purposes, which the government needs to be able to identify. And the Disaster Management Act actually contains a list of the reasons for which legislation can be passed that will limit rights. You need to be able to show, or the government needs to be able to show, when it passes a measure, how those measures further the objectives set out in the Act. What's been happening so far is that the government doesn't really bother to make that argument. And I think now that the case law is forcing the government to make that argument, it might be more careful when it writes the regulations as well. I mean, one of the best examples is actually tobacco, because when tobacco was first banned, the reason given in a press conference was, well, it's for health reasons. I remember President Ramaphosa saying that. That's not good enough. It's not one of the reasons set out in the Disaster Management Act for which rights can be limited. And it's also not a reason that specifically connects to the pandemic, because the health-related dangers of smoking apply all the time. You need to show that they have some special connection with the pandemic, and that was not done. Not done satisfactorily, according to the court as well, most recently.
And very quickly, Prof, before I let you go, can this matter stand in court? And I'm talking here in the part of government.
Can this matter? Oh, you mean the beaches?
Absolutely.
I think that the government has a good chance. I think it is. The science has established that having a whole lot of people close together where compliance with masking regulations is poor does pose a significant health risk. So the government has a good chance. I think it just needs to be able to make its own argument, because it's got the job now of justifying the limitation of rights. And also it may need to show why it adopted more restrictive measures in some areas than in others. That needs to make sense. But otherwise, I think, well argued, that this case is a pretty easy one to argue. Just be aware, though, that we don't just have Section 21, which is freedom of movement. We also have Section 22, which is the freedom to choose and run a trade. And I think that's one of the other complaints that's coming in from the people whose livelihoods are threatened by the measures. Remember, we're not one of those wealthy countries where people who lose income due to coronavirus simply get reimbursed by government. So there needs to be a different kind of balancing here.
And in fact, that's a very valid point, given that there is this balancing act between livelihood and safety that is important. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Associate Professor Cathleen Powell, Associate Professor in Public Law at the University of Cape Town.